Well, good morning. Thank you for your time today. As always, we are grateful for the time that we get to connect with you via these webinars. I know I see a lot of familiar names in the chat, but for those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we jump right in, I wanted to point out that I have colleagues on the call who can answer your questions via the chat function or the questions tab, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. You should see a button for questions on the side or bottom of the screen. They'll answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know of any questions they think would be useful for the entire group. I also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. And as a reminder, you can review our past webinars on the YouTube channel that we have, which you can find at video.servicetech.com. We'll take a look at that at the end of the time here today as well. So today, we will be covering the topic of accepting signatures from volunteers within CERVIS and kind of the different methods for doing so, primarily the terms and conditions. As always, we're going to start out by clarifying some of the language around the subject. Then we'll proceed to kind of the options available within the system. We'll discuss how the terms and conditions are presented to volunteers, how they sign them, how you can ask them to re-sign them. Then we're going to check out the different ways that you can review those signed terms, both current and historic. And then at the end, we'll discuss a couple alternative ways to deliver documents to volunteers, especially in the cases where you need wet signatures or physical signatures from volunteers. So let's jump into it. What are the terms and conditions as such, or kind of what does that represent within CERVIS? To do this, I actually want to step away to the application page first. When a volunteer is engaging with CERVIS, the first thing they typically do is fill out an application, and that might be within the confines or within kind of the process of signing up for an event. But one of the first things they'll need to do, obviously, is give you their information. One of the things you can ask from volunteers is for them to sign your terms and conditions. So the terms or the language, terms and conditions, is something that you can modify in terms of how it's presented to volunteers or how they read that. But in CERVIS, we refer to this as terms and conditions. And so essentially what you're doing here is asking volunteers to agree to some kind of language. Now, what this represents is entirely up to you. You might choose to have some kind of hold harmless or liability waiver. You might have a volunteer policy or a code of conduct. You might have a photo release or guidelines or all sorts of different things. What you have in here is obviously entirely up to you. What we're looking at here is my demonstration console. But the idea here is that I'm asking volunteers to agree to these terms. And then in addition to that, I'm having them sign. So we have a signature field here that the volunteer would type in their name for. We're going to dig into how volunteers sign these a little bit more later. We'll talk about this parent or guardian signature as well. But again, the idea is I'm asking volunteers to sign some terms as a part of engaging with the platform. I just want to be clear, these are not services terms. We don't have anything like that the volunteer is agreeing to. This is something that you establish in your system and you can choose to use. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now let's back up to the admin side and look at the different options kind of associated with this. So where we'll find the terms and conditions is in the system configuration. So same place actually where you would edit what data's on your application, what data you're collecting from volunteers. If we go into the system configuration, there's two sections we're kind of concerned with here. We have information collection and then custom volunteer profile fields. But in this case, information collection contains what we're looking for. And if we go into that section, most of this is, again, just questions on the application. But if we scroll to the bottom, there are two sections I want to point out. One we're going to come back to in a little bit here, kind of towards the end today, is referred to as the liability waiver or medical release. And again, we're going to come back to this one. So put a pin in this, but I kind of tend to refer to this as a paper waiver, right? But what we're looking at first here is your terms and conditions. So that's going to be the bottom of this section here. And there's a few different options related to the terms. You have whether or not you're using the terms. So there's a simple yes-no kind of dichotomy here. If you are using the terms, there are a couple different settings. You can tell the system that these terms are informational only, so the volunteers aren't going to be asked to accept these terms. They're just presented to them. If you want to do something like that, we also have a privacy policy option that you can display to volunteers or have displayed to volunteers that isn't asking for them to agree to those terms necessarily. Generally, how these are used is that you're asking volunteers to accept the terms. So you can say yes, must accept, or must accept inline. This just changes the presentation of the terms. What I showed previously on my application page was the inline option. And again, that essentially just has the terms directly laid out. So the volunteers don't have to click a button to review or see the terms. They'll just see it directly on the page where they're agreeing to them. This is a personal preference thing. You might have some kind of conditions based on your legal and what they'd like to see presented here, but that's essentially just changing the visibility of the terms. If you don't do the inline option, then instead of having them immediately displayed, there's a click here to view option, and then volunteers would click on that and that would pop up what you actually have written out as your terms. So that's what this option is. By default, if you're just looking at this, you might already have it turned on. It might have already been established previous to you, but the must accept options would require that volunteers sign these terms. To the right of that, you can kind of include the context of how is someone agreeing to these terms. There's an option for checkbox only. So if you don't want a signature field, you just want people to check a box next to your intro text, which is right below that, then you can just do checkbox only. The other options are to require a typed signature, and also, if you'd like to, you can include the parent or guardian option. So that's how I have mine established. And again, if we look at this, kind of preview what this looks like, you can see there's a checkbox that volunteers would have to select, and that's next to the intro text. And of course, below that is the actual terms that they're agreeing to. We'll get to this in a moment. And then below that, we see two signature fields. So there's the legal name, and then below that, the parent or guardian signature. Now, the parent or guardian signature is enforced if a volunteer is under 18 based on their birth date. So in order for this to be enforced, you do also need to be tracking birth date on your application. You can quickly check that. If we scroll up in this section, you can see there's an option for track volunteer birth date, and this can be set to yes required, yes optional, or no. So if this is required, a volunteer cannot create a profile without giving you their birth date. And if they're under 18 and they haven't had their parent already sign the terms in that parent signature, then that would be required before they could proceed. So that's kind of how that functions. If you don't need to include that option, then obviously you can just set this to require type signature, and then there would only be one signature field as opposed to having the parent or guardian option as well. So below these settings, we have the intro text, which again, this is next to the checkbox that the volunteer is agreeing to. So you can edit this. I mentioned earlier the language, terms and conditions is in CERVIS. On the back end, you're going to see this in several places, but your volunteers can read this very differently because you can change the intro text. You don't have to necessarily use that language if you don't want to. So you can modify that through here. And then of course, the terms that they're actually agreeing to are below that in this larger field. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of different things that you could choose to capture through here. This is up to you and your organization. Frequently we see things like a liability waiver, hold harmless agreement, photo release, volunteer code of conduct, that kind of stuff. But it's really up to you what you want to collect through here. A lot of times this is a bundle of different signatures kind of in one, just by using headings to kind of demarc the different sections. So there's a lot of ways that you can edit the text in here. You have a lot of control over the formatting, so obviously feel free to do that as you need to. And then you can use this preview icon like I've been doing to see kind of what that looks like on the application. So this just pulls up kind of a sample application page with the terms in place so you can see what that might look like. Now in mine, I do have actually a download link. You don't necessarily need to do things, and a lot of times I actually don't recommend doing this. So you have the option to insert links in here, and in my case, I've inserted a link to like volunteer information and guidelines, right? So this is more of a document that's intended to be a reference to volunteers, not necessarily something that they're agreeing to. Anything that you want volunteers to be agreeing to, I would lay that text out directly in here as opposed to linking out to a document. We'll get to that reason a little bit more firmly a little bit later, but just in brief, the reason I would say that is because you can download a copy of the volunteers' signed terms. So it actually says what they agreed to. So what did the terms themselves say? And if you're linking out to documents, there's not really a way to guarantee that what's behind that link hasn't changed since they signed them. Okay, so these are the settings as they pertain to the terms and conditions. Now let's talk about when does a volunteer sign your terms and conditions. And one of those places we've already looked at today is the initial application. Now I do want to make sure to point out that what I'm talking about is your general application. You do have the ability to have volunteers fill out what's called the Quick Reg application, which is essentially a truncated version of that. It's like a cherry-picked version of your application where less questions are being asked. The terms and conditions do not necessarily have to be on your Quick Reg application. I would say that most people choose to include them, but that is a choice. So if we scroll up to the top of this section for information collection, the first item in here is to reorder your volunteer profile fields and configure your Quick Reg fields. So if we enter this menu, on the right-hand side, these checkboxes indicate whether or not something is a part of your Quick Reg application. And if we scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that terms and conditions is an option in here. This is not selected by default. So if you would like this to be selected on your Quick Reg application, you do need to choose that and then click to save the order. Okay, so again, when a volunteer is initially creating a profile with you, if they're signing up for an event, they'll see your terms on the initial application. So that's one place where volunteers would be asked to agree to your terms. If they're engaging with the platform themselves, they're creating their own profile, they're signing up for an event, they're going to be required to sign those terms. Of course, if you create a profile for a volunteer, that's not the case. When you create an account for someone, you can't sign the terms on their behalf. That would kind of invalidate the purpose of the terms. So instead, what will happen is when you create a profile for someone through the admin side, the system will automatically set what's called requiring verification, so that the next time that volunteer logs in or tries to sign up for an event, they will be presented with essentially their application and the information that you put in, and they'll be asked to fill out the rest of their profile as well as sign your terms. So it's something that the volunteer has to do, not something that you can do on behalf of the volunteer. There's one other place where a volunteer can be asked to sign your terms, and that would be through the sign-in console. So if you have the sign-in console open, you can have it set so that volunteers are required to sign the terms if they don't already have a copy on file. So let me just pull up an example here. So if I try to sign into my account here, I haven't signed the most recent terms in my system. So before I can proceed, the system is requiring that I check the box here and that I sign these terms before I could actually sign in for my shift. So this just becomes a part of the sign-in process. And again, that is specifically if the volunteer has not already signed your current terms and conditions. I use the term current there very specifically because if you change your terms and conditions, if you make any changes to the language, Service will recognize that as a new set of terms and conditions. So even if someone had signed them yesterday, well, now they don't have a current copy on file because you've changed the terms. Okay, so let's back up here. There's one more thing that I'd like to mention about having your volunteers sign your terms. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but you can do something within Service called requiring verification of volunteer profile information, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. Essentially, you can enforce that volunteers look over their profile the next time they log into their account. And when you do that, the system will actually require that a volunteer re-sign your terms if they don't have a current copy on file. So kind of the scenario we just described where they haven't signed the current copy of the terms. But it will also have them re-sign the terms if it has been more than a year since the volunteer last signed the terms. So this might be something you want to do year over year anyway. So what you basically, to enforce this require verification option, what you need to do is go into your volunteer database. If we go into search and manage volunteer database, we could search for a set of individuals, like if you want to look for only active volunteers. But what I typically do is just leave this blank to show everyone in the system. There's kind of no harm, no foul in doing this for inactive profiles. But what we can do is select all the results. In the drop down here, we can choose to do a bulk update. So update selected volunteer profiles. And then at the bottom of this list, there's an option that says exactly what we've been talking about, require verification of volunteer profile information. And if we go ahead and select this, select yes here, that's the only option. Essentially, again, this is like a hidden field that volunteers don't see, but the next time someone logs into their account or tries to sign up for an event, it will force them to verify their profile, which again would have them fill in any gaps in their account. Maybe you've changed the application since people last looked at their profile. And then it will also enforce that people re-sign your terms if it has been more than a year, or if they don't have a copy of the current terms on file. Okay, and like I said, there's kind of no harm, no foul in doing this for inactive accounts, and what I typically recommend is doing this once per year. So essentially when a volunteer logs back in next, they're going to be required to look over their profile and make sure everything is up to date and that your terms are signed. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is where can you actually review these signed terms? Because yes, it's great you're collecting these signatures, but where do you actually engage with this information? And that's going to be done in the same place we're in right now, the volunteer database. So just to be sure, from the main dashboard, under volunteer management, click into search and manage volunteer database. If you're looking for a particular individual, you can search for that person by name. You can also run searches based on your terms and conditions. So if we go into the advanced search, we can use one of the menu items here is volunteer terms and conditions options. And we can find people maybe who signed the terms on a particular day, or who either do or do not have a copy of the terms on file, or whose signature is greater than a certain number of months old. So there's a number of different searches that you can run through here. But if we go ahead and run a search or look at a set of individuals, so I signed the terms just as we were in the sign-in console earlier. And if we go and look at a volunteer's profile, so click View Profile Details, scroll down about halfway through, you'll see a field for accepted terms and conditions. And this will store up to 10 dates. So you could have historic copies of somebody's terms on file, like the previous dates that they signed those terms. Each of these is clickable. So if we click on that, it'll prompt a download for a copy of those terms. So this will produce a PDF. I'm going to open that up here. This PDF can use a header image. This is in your system configuration. It is blank by default. I typically recommend using letterhead for this. Any PDF that CERVIS produces, like reports that volunteers can generate themselves or reports that you might generate, and obviously this document here will use that image. So if you'd like to have a letterhead or something like that on these types of documents, just submit a ticket to our customer support team. But what we're seeing in this document, if we zoom in a bit here, you can see the person's contact information who signed the terms. Below that, we see the terms themselves. When were these terms posted? So when were they last edited, and what did they actually say? So the content of the terms themselves. And this is what I mentioned earlier, why you might not necessarily want to have documents linked out, because there's not really a way to guarantee that what's behind this link hasn't changed. Whereas if I just have this data directly in the terms, you can see it's reproduced in this, signed document. And then below that, we get the volunteer's signature information. So we see how they signed. If there was a parent signature, that would show up in here as well. We can see when they signed, and then how they were authenticated. and then we also see a document seal. So you can produce this document for volunteers, and again, you can grab the historic copies of that as well. You can have up to 10 of these stored in here at a time. Once there are 10, it will just start dropping the oldest ones. You can also see this from the volunteer perspective. So if a volunteer logs into their account, there's a section for viewing posted documents, which is a way for you to deliver documents to volunteers. But one of the documents they will see in here is their most recent signed terms. So they can go and download that exact same document. This is the same thing. They can just pull this themselves if they'd like to, so they can go and read their own terms that they agreed to. Okay, so those are the different ways to kind of review the documents on volunteers' profiles. We talked about kind of enforcing signing the terms and how to kind of have volunteers re-sign the terms. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention about the terms, and then I want to talk about a couple other ways to deliver documents to volunteers. I mentioned and I showed in my system that I have the terms showing up in the sign-in console. That is a setting. So if we go into the system configuration, there's a section called Sign-in Console or Kiosk Options. And in here, towards the bottom, you can tell the system to display the terms and conditions during sign-in. This can be set to no, so of course in this case they won't show up. Or you can say only on mobile sign-in, only on the standalone console, or both. And again, they're not going to show up every time. They are only going to show up if a volunteer does not have a copy of the current terms already on their profile. So I did want to point that out. That is specifically a setting, so you don't necessarily have to have that on, or you may want to check that it is on if you'd like to use it. Okay, now let's talk about two other ways to sort of deliver documents to volunteers. One of them I sort of glossed over earlier, and that's also in the system configuration in the information collection section. And that would be this liability waiver or medical release. Again, I kind of referred to this as like a paper document. What this is doing is instead of having your volunteers sign the terms when they create a profile, and again, this would be like a digital signature, the liability waiver is sending a link to volunteers when they sign up for events that require this document. What this document is called is up to you. You can edit that through here. Typically, this might be a liability waiver or medical release, something like that, but obviously you can edit what this is. Essentially, what this document is asking volunteers to do, though, is to sign it when they sign up for certain events where it's enforced. So the document needs to be hosted online somewhere. So if you already have it hosted, you can just paste the link in here. If you don't already have it listed somewhere, you can do that in CERVIS. Under the system management heading, there is a file management section. In here, you can post documents. And then if you want to, you can grab the direct file link here. So if we grab that, we can go and put this in the system configuration. So we could paste that document in here. If you have a totally separate document for children as compared to for adults, then you could separate that out. Otherwise, you can leave the second one blank. But essentially, when this is in use, so if we go ahead and update my configuration, because I've added this now, on every opportunity, I can tell the system whether or not the liability waiver is required. And again, what it's called here is something you set. That's in the system configuration. So if I have this set to yes on an event, when a volunteer registers for this event, the system will send in the confirmation message a blurb about downloading this document, printing it out, signing it, and then returning it to me. That blurb is actually something you can edit. So if instead of sending out a physical document, you actually wanted to send out a link to DocuSign or something like that, you could do that instead. Now, this isn't sent to everyone. It's only sent to people who have not already returned this document to you. So if you do have this setting turned on, you may see on volunteer profiles, or rather you will see, an option that asks if there's a current liability waiver or medical release on file. So every person's profile will have this kind of language. And if you're seeing this and you don't use this, you can turn that off as well. But again, what it's called here, that's up to you. And if someone does return this document and you want to denote that on their account, you can switch that to yes for that individual. And then when they sign up for an event that requires this document, they won't be sent it again because the system knows they've already returned it. So this is one way to deliver documents to volunteers kind of otherwise, especially if you need wet signatures from volunteers. And then one other way to deliver documents is actually by uploading them and posting them. So in CERVIS, like we looked at earlier, there's a file management section. You can upload documents through here. And once you've uploaded a document, you can choose to post it. You don't have to. By default, these documents are not visible to volunteers. But if we choose to post this document, what that will do is kind of deliver it to all of the volunteers. So if I post this, and then if we switch to view the system as a volunteer, there's that same posted document section we looked at earlier. And now in here, we can see that flyer that I posted. So now everyone in the system, all my volunteers, can go and download this document from this section whenever they'd like to. I've posted it as available to my volunteers. Now, you don't have to post documents for every volunteer. You can post them in particular sections or for particular people. So we just did that through the file management section under system management. So this is like a system-wide kind of document. But you can do the same sort of thing through groups. So you could attach a document to a particular group. You can go in and edit the group and basically add documents to it. So you can attach documents through here and then post them for that group. That would only allow the members of that group to see that document in the posted documents section. You can do the same thing on volunteer profiles as individuals. So you can go in and attach a document to an individual volunteer, and then you could post that document for that individual volunteer. So only they would see that document in that posted document section. And then you can also do this through events. So if you have a particular opportunity and you want all of the people who are registered for that event to be able to download a particular posted document, something like that, you can, again, attach a document to an event. So if we go in to manage this opportunity, there's a section for viewing or updating file attachments. We could add a document through here and then attach it and post it in the same way. Now this actually does two things. It adds it to that posted document section for any person who's registered for this event, but then it will also include that document as an attachment on the confirmation and reminder emails for this event. Now, if you're going to do that, I would always encourage you to reference that in the description of the event, just to make sure people know that that document is coming. But that can be a really nice way to send things out to volunteers, especially if you have event-specific documentation or signatures that you need, and you don't want to use the liability waiver. You could, attach those and post those to particular opportunities. And then one last thing, kind of in partnership with that idea. If you would like to have volunteers scan documents and then deliver them to you, there is an option to allow volunteers to upload file attachments to their own account. So that would be under the posted documents section. So a volunteer would log in, and then in here they can go to upload file attachments, add a document, and then post that to their own profile. You can be notified of this if you'd like to, and you can also search for people who've recently posted documents to their account. And then, of course, you can go and manage those if you want to, or go and download them or delete them. Okay, so we overviewed a couple different things today. Primarily, we looked at the terms and conditions, so a way to accept digital signatures from volunteers, and for you to kind of modify that in the system configuration and configure how those are collected from volunteers. And then we looked at how you can reinforce that volunteers sign those terms. So essentially requiring verification from volunteers the next time that they engage with the platform, or posting those terms on your sign-in console so that when they show up for a shift, they do have to ensure that those terms have been signed. And then we also looked at how you can download those documents on volunteer accounts and search by that information. So the last thing we looked at today was different ways to collect documents or signatures from volunteers, and kind of the different ways that you can post documents for volunteers. There's a number of different ways to collect signatures or agreements from volunteers. And those are kind of the different ways to do that within Service. And of course, if you have any other questions, we're happy to take those. I do want to mention a couple resources that are available to you. So at the bottom of the page, whenever you're logged in as an administrator, you will see this Need Help button. And if we go ahead and click on that, this asks, how can we help? And you can type in questions through here. So let's say you want to learn more about the terms. We have a number of articles written about the terms and conditions and how to set those up and establish those. But regardless what you've searched for, you can always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket to our customer support team. They're very responsive and they are excellent if you've not used them previously. And then one last resource I wanted to mention, I mentioned it at the top today, is our YouTube library of recorded tutorials and webinars. So if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you to our YouTube channel. And from here, you can review different playlists that we've established, as well as the different individual videos, things that we've uploaded in the past. And all of our previously recorded webinars are available on here as well. So once again, I want to thank you for your time today. It is always a pleasure to see you in the chat. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so thank you for joining. We as a team are grateful for the work that you're doing and all the different communities that you're impacting. That's a very satisfying aspect of our work to get to work with you. So if you have any questions from our content today, or really anything else regarding utilizing your terms and conditions or just your console as a whole, again, don't hesitate to use that Need Help option or contact our customer support team directly. So thanks for your time. Hope you have a great rest of your week.